Good morning, everybody. Really delighted to welcome you all to the launch of the Big Consult. This summarises the responses from a range of adopted people and teenagers to those adults who've been adopted over the years, but also birth parents whose children have been adopted since 1990. I've worked in fostering and adoption for many years, and I know that the impact of adoption is lifelong for all of those people involved. And this can be a very positive experience for many, but we also know that it also involves loss and separation and often trauma from early life experiences. We also know that we need to do better to support children growing up into adults to have a positive sense of their identity and understanding about why they were unable to live with their birth parents or kinship network. As children come into care, the first consideration must always be for them to return to their birth parents where it is safe and appropriate for them to do so, and if not, to live within their kinship network. Where this isn't possible, adoption can provide a positive outcome for some children, and the policy and legislative framework that we have in England continue to support that this is a positive, long-term, lifelong option for children. Over the years, we've had some excellent consultation with adoptive parents who we know are well placed to help shape the development of services in adoption. However, we have heard less from children and young people and adopted adults, and even less from birth parents who we know have very few opportunities to share their voices to help shape and influence services. However, they all have an important and continuing role to play for their children as they grow and develop into adults, and it's crucial that we hear from them and learn to improve the support that is available for them, whether they're caring for their children or unable to care for their children. I know that regional adoption agencies who commission these reports really welcome the publication of this consultation, which will help them and their local authorities to help shape the direction of practice and service development. And there are many messages in here for central government as well. The messages, having just quickly looked at the report this morning, are very clear about the additional need to support birth families and also adopted children and adopted adults understand their identity through life story work, therapeutic provision, and particularly ongoing relationships with their birth family and other people important to them post-adoption. So I'm going to hand over now to Mike Hancock, who is going to take you through the Big Consult and share some of the findings of the report. So over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And thanks a lot for commissioning these reports, which, as you say, are vital and needed because really we don't hear enough of the voices of adopted people and birth parents. I'd like to say our inspiration in a way is the impact that the Adoption UK barometer has had in raising the voice of adopted parents. And just a quick shout out to Becky Brooks because she's been very generous with her advice about this, although she takes no responsibility or should do for any of its failures. But the barometer has been fantastic. And what we wanted to do was say, well, where are the other voices here? Can we amplify them and produce something which is a little bit like that so that people can see how we're doing in various stages of adoption now, how we're serving people in the past. And unless we listen to the voices of birth parents and adopted people, well, we can't really do adoption and permanence without them, to be honest, because they're part of it. Adoptees will turn around and say, well, why aren't you listening? Why didn't you listen? Just as with the apology which is going on at the moment, or demand for an apology from the government about historic adoption, people are saying, well, why on earth weren't we listened to? Why don't you listen to us now? And those adopted people are finding their voice along with birth mothers from the 50s onwards, which is great. And we need to hear them to clear up the trauma of those mistakes and to make sure that we don't replicate them now. So the birth parent report we're going to present today, the adoptees are from the 1950s onwards. The birth parent report concentrates on the 1990s onwards. And we desperately need to do another survey for the 50s to 80s generation. And I would really like to take that forward. Now, we can't move forward to a modern open adoption system without listening, without birth parents. They've just by definition got to be part of that, and birth families. So it's really crucial that we hear from them. Now, we think this is the largest survey for some time of these client groups. We've had 600 people respond to this, and I've just got to say a massive thank you to all those people who took the time to do that, and some of you are here today, which is great. What we don't hear from is the silent adoptees and the silent birth parents, those who don't either identify in those groups so strongly or drift away from services altogether, and we can't hear from them, which is really sad. So this survey, these consults ask some big questions, and they are in a sense a start. All this needs further study and analysis, but I think what you're going to get is really interesting. And we think that the views and experience of these client groups needs to be embodied in policy and practice and the REAs, just as those of the adopters are. So this is a start really in hearing those. So just to tell you what's happening today, I'm going to present the reports. It's a presentation. The actual reports are going to be on our website straight away. We're going to send you those reports this afternoon, and we're going to put them out far and wide, and we want them to be spread all over the place. They're pretty easily readable. There are 4 pages of summary report for each report, and then there are 15 to 20 pages with lovely graphics and all the rest of it. So they're very easily digestible. And what we hope is that people will both read those, but also dip into those. So if you work in letterbox or education, or you're interested in intermediary, you can say, how are we doing? What do these client groups think about those things? It's going to take me 15 to 20 minutes to present each report. I'm going to do the adoptees one first. That's slightly longer. The survey was slightly longer. And then we are going to have a small panel of 3 adopted people discussing what they thought were the main points out of that. And then we'll turn to the birth parent consult, and we'll do the same. We've got 3 birth parents, and I'll introduce them later. We'll also, if you've got things you really want to express or questions, we will try and address those if you put them in the chat, but that really depends a bit on time. Now, just for fair disclosure on this, it's fair to say to everybody that I also was adopted. So why do I say that to you? Well, partly because I think you'll probably listen a bit more if I say that to you. And also really that I have my own biases around this kind of stuff, but I'll be honest with you, I think we all do, whether we're participants in it or not. But I'll try and keep them out today and stick to what the respondents of the survey said. So I'm going to first of all share the the adopted people's consult. Okay, so just to go back on that point. So we have more from the historic generations, if you like, my generation, but we've got enough, I think, to be able to track some of these responses through time. And that's what we're going to be doing in these surveys as well. You'll see in a minute. For their people from across the UK, England, 72% were female respondents, 81% described themselves as heterosexual, and 22% said they had a disability. We've got 71% were white British, and then we have a range of other ethnicities there. Some of those people obviously may not have been clear about those ethnicities until later in their lives. So we asked, the first section we did was about growing up adopted. We said to people, while you were under 18, do you think you were given enough information about your birth parents? So the whole responses were only 17% of people, that's the figure on the right, said that they had enough information. Now, just let me explain this graph, because a lot of them take this format. So on the left-hand side in the light pink, those are the yeses. And you can see those yeses, I got enough information about my birth parents, growing over the years from the 1950s up to the 1990s, 2000s, where we reached 50% and seemed to plateau a bit. So on the positive side, there's definitely been movement there. On the negative side, we still have half our respondents saying, I didn't have enough information about my birth family. We asked the same question, did you have enough information about why you were adopted? 23% said overall that they had enough information, not very many. Again, on the left-hand side of the graph, we can see that growing over the years up to 63% in the 2000s. Now, this is a really crucial one. I think identity is such a big issue for adopted people, and we'll be talking about that a bit later on. So of our whole survey, only 13% of people said they had enough to make sense of their identity, which is very small, isn't it? There has been an improvement over the years, definitely, but children are given more information. We're up to 46% in the 2000s. So improvement, but how far? So the vast majority of respondents wished there had been more openness and honesty around their birth family and the reasons for the adoption, and regretted their adoptive parents had not managed this or had the support and knowledge to be open. Many also regretted lack of contact with birth family. So we, again, in Growing Up Adopted, we asked, now this is a very broad question. We said, do you think you and your adoptive parents were a good match? Some people quite understandably said, what and how on earth do you expect me to answer that? That's a bit of a strange yes or no question, isn't it? But we wanted to throw it out there and we wanted to see what came back. And there is a progression in the right direction. We have up to 91% in the 2000s, although many of those will still be under 18. But many commented on the lack of openness about their adoption, the difference in class background and age gaps as creating distance between them and their adoptive family. We had hundreds of responses to this question, and that is a whole study in itself, which I think would be really interesting to make because we understand it's a very broad one. We asked, were you transracially or transnationally adopted? Well, as you would expect from its heyday in the 70s and 80s, those numbers have really declined to only 3% of respondents in the 2000s. But for those who were, we said, did you feel that that was appropriate? And I'll be honest, there were fairly negative comments. This is fairly representative. It was hard being the only brown person in a 50-mile radius. I felt like I had to be the ambassador for all brown people. So there's more information, as I say, you're getting snippets and highlights here rather than the full report, which you'll be able to read on yourself. So we also asked, did you feel supported in your move to adulthood, living independently and further education? No movement here over time. So people not feeling that that was the case. We asked people what helped or not. And the most common help cited was the support of adoptive parents, followed by actually what helped was moving out of the family home. Many stressed their own independence and reliance on friends. Services helped and the lack of them were greatly regretted. So we've got some recommendations here based on what adopted people have told us. Increase the focus on openness and honesty in adoption, obviously. Prepare adopters to strengthen the child's identity with age-appropriate information. Many people commented that they didn't feel that their parents were equipped to give them that information. Use transracial and transnational adoption only as a very last resort. And enhance transition services for adoptees reaching 18. Okay, let's move on to education. So we said, did adoption affect your experience of education? Overall, 58% said that adoption affected their education, and those numbers have remained fairly static over time that we can see. And did your school recognise adoption as an issue? Again, there's some marginal growth in that left-hand light pink. I hope I'm not going through these stats too quickly because I've looked at them hundreds of times and I'm sure seeing them for the first time. But remember, on the left hand side in that light pink, you've got the yeses. So we're up to 6%, 12% of schools recognizing adoption as an issue by the 2000s. Overall, only 3%. I was not able to manage the school environment due to my trauma and anxiety. I needed a small school who were trauma informed. Did you feel sufficiently supported in school? Again, there's some marginal improvement here, but again, not very much, going up to 20, 24, 31% over the last 20 or 30 years. We said what helped or not. Some found the lack of acknowledgement of their adoption allowed them to fit in, while others found the silence deafening and harmful. So increased teacher training around adoption and attachment. I know that that's happening, but clearly not enough. Involve adopted young people and adults in enhancing services. Okay, we asked about contact. Do you have any contact? Any contact? This is direct, indirect, letterbox, whatever it was. Did you have any contact with any birth family members while you were under 18? So as you would expect, those figures grow on the left-hand side. There we go. Over the years, 11% in the 70s, up to 20%. And then we're really entering the year of letterbox in the 1990s, 39% and 53% in the 2000s. But given that this is the model of adoption that we're operating, we also still have 47% there in the 2000s, 61% in the 1990s, who are not having any contact with their birth families, whether direct or indirect. They're meeting a range of birth family members in direct contact, and I'm going to just move on from that for a second. Okay, 98% adopted since 1990 said they had letterbox contact to start with 42% reporting they received letters over 6 years. 65%, actually, that's 65% were involved in writing letters to birth family, and 70% received photos. 39% felt positive about letterbox, and 62% of those who didn't have any contact under 18 regretted it. So when asked, this is about direct contact, when asked what could improve it, respondents reflected that they would like to be able to talk about the difficult feelings that arise from these meetings with their birth family, and they have support with how to address any negative reactions from their adoptive family. If you had letterbox, how long did it last? Well, on the right-hand side here, we've got the 6 to 10 years, and we've got in the deep red, and we've got the 11+ years. Not very long is the answer to that, and that's borne out by our findings with birth parents, that where letterbox was established, often it either didn't happen or it happened for 1 or 2 years. We asked our adopted people, should direct contact, e.g. meetings between adopted children, young people and birth family members be standard practice in adoption where it is deemed safe? And resounding yes, I would say there. Falling slightly in the 2000s. We have to remember that some of those people are still under 18, but well over 70% on all those ratings. So strong support from adopted people for openness and contact. Who should decide it if that's going to take place? Well, 56% of those people said adopted young person. It is for the person who is adopted to decide. So much of adoption involves other people making decisions on your behalf, which may or not be the right ones. So make direct contact with appropriate members of birth family. Standard practice is what adopted people are saying. Recruit adopters who are open to this. Create robust contact services and invest in digital contact solutions. So letters, which there are pilots at the moment, and review contact arrangements. Okay, mental health. We have, I was cocky about time. I'm now thinking, right, I need to get through this slightly. So I'm going to just slightly whip up the pace a little bit. Did you receive therapeutic support under 18? Obviously, those figures grow over time, as you would expect. 77% have accessed mental health or therapeutic support as an adult, a high figure. We asked, would you consider accessing therapy if it was free or had to pay for it? 93% if it was free, 62% if you had to pay. Similarly with group support, 86% if it was free, 47% if you had to pay for it. So there you see the barriers and the numbers of people who would not access support if they had to pay. So we would recommend broaden access to quality therapeutic services for adopted people, review how this quality is maintained through training and regulation, and consider making the Adoption Support Fund open to all adopted people. I know that's a radical idea, but this, as Sarah said, is a lifelong journey for people. Adoption records. Have you tried to access your adoption records? Hugely high numbers of people growing over from the 60s, 70s, right through to the 90s. And as you would expect, lower numbers in the 2000s, as many have not reached 18. So most people, of our respondents anyway, are accessing their records, but only 56% thought that they were adequately supported through the process. We asked how long it took for them to get those records, and we've got about 60% there down the bottom, under 6 months. And then we've got 17% 6 months to a year, and 25% of people saying that took over a year. We also have 52% saying they weren't satisfied with the information they received. 186 responses we had to this saying, reporting inadequate information, many lost records, lengthy timescales, lack of support, and a failure of trust that agencies or the courts will share what the person holds about an adopted person's life. So we need better records, access, we need dedicated staff. We need those to be rewarded for the agencies who hold records, and we need more training. And I would say, and this is in discussion, I know, set minimum timescales and review progress. Okay, intermediary and reunion, we're on to the last section of this report. Have you attempted to have contact with any birth family member since you were 18? Huge, well over 80% in all those decades. And obviously less in the 2000s, as many of those will be still under 18. So the message here, 85% overall have attempted to have contact with their birth families since reaching 18. So I think the message here is that it's when rather than if for most people, or most of our respondents anyway. If they hadn't attempted this, why was this? The leading cause was not wanting to upset adoptive family. Just going to have a closer look at these stats on the right. This is really interesting, I think, especially for adopted people. 55% used an intermediary agency. 73% said that agency support was satisfactory. 86% used a free intermediary service. Well, they're not free for most people anymore, and that number at the top, that 55%, will only grow. 77% said the birth family member responded positively to their initial approach. So I think that's a really heartening thing for adopted people. 77 people got a positive response. 92% said they were glad that they had attempted contact, and 59% maintain a relationship with their birth relative. So I think that's a heartening thing for adopted people to hear when they're thinking about intermediary and reunion. We would say access to affordable intermediary services need to happen for birth parents and adopted adults, and prepare adopters to support their children in reunion. So just last thoughts on the future. 66% thought adoption remains an appropriate form of permanence, and 90% thought that adoption should be more open. And there are some ideas for the future here, mostly about openness, more services, greater resources, support for adoptive parents and families. And just there, I'm going to stop sharing. And I know there's only so many stats that everybody can take. So, you know, you're going to have to look at that in your own time when we send you the report or you access it on our website. And I'd really like to bring in some faces now, because you'll be statted out already. So if I could just bring in Emma. And so we've got adopted people. We've got Emma Johnson. We've got Jilly Bruce. Can we get Jilly up as well, please? And we've also got JP. Okay, so you're all unmuted. Brilliant. All right, Emma, would you like to go?
Yeah, of course.
Would you like to go, Emma, and just tell us what chimed with the report with you?
Yeah, of course. So I think the main thing for me was my sense of identity. So I was transracially adopted into a white family at 6 weeks old. And I have to just put out there that I was very lucky. I've got an amazing family. My mum and dad were very open and very supportive. However, being the only brown person in my world was really challenging. I lived in a white area. I went to a white school. There weren't any other people that looked like me. And that has caused me issues throughout my life. Like you say, Mike, adoption is a lifelong thing, and it doesn't get any easier. I think actually as you become an adult and look back on things, it perhaps becomes a bit harder. So for me, it was the identity thing and the transracial adoption. That was my biggest thing.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, absolutely. That identity thing, obviously, you know, you carry in a sense an extra layer of that, but that was something which chimed with you too, wasn't it, Jilly, I think?
Definitely, yeah. Good morning, everyone. No, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I was adopted in 1962, and I think one of the issues, well, I just felt like a leaf on the breeze. I didn't know who I belonged to. Really, you know, you got this idea that you're kind of ours, but you're kind of not. And the other thing that didn't help with the identity thing, part of the growing up adopted section, was that I was told very nicely that my mum wanted to keep me, but she couldn't, and all of this, very positive. But what I didn't hear was that I would never be given away again. And of course, your adopted parents don't think to tell you that because they know they're not going to give you away again. But I didn't get that message, you know, so it's much about what you do hear is what you don't hear. So because I never got to hear you will never be given away again, I spent my whole life being a super good girl so that wouldn't be given away again, and could not be my authentic self. And therefore that undermines your sense of identity because you kind of know you're not being your real self because you're dead. You know, so that's kind of makes that sense of identity thing even worse. Not only do you not know who you are, but you kind of can't be who you are.
Does that chime with you, Emma, too?
Yeah, it does. I think for me, it was that kind of thing came through in my dreams. I'd have the same, well, there were nightmares really over and over again as I was a child. And I think at the time I didn't think about it, but now looking back, it was all about abandonment and loss. So although it wasn't conscious, it was there. It was there, yeah, an awful lot.
JP, can I bring you in? Can you hear us all right, JP?
Yeah, I can hear you. I've just been listening.
We're getting a lovely shot of you walking through sunshine, JP, which is great. Are you okay?
Yeah, it doesn't stop, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
And when it all happens, it happens at once.
That's okay. What would you like to say? What chimed with you with the report, JP?
A few things. The education thing is I found interesting, but I also understand it because I had support teachers at school and they really helped shape who I became. Especially one called Mrs. Fenn. She was an art teacher and she didn't have to, but especially after school, she was like, sit with me and wait until my adopted mum came to pick me up. And like I'd draw a picture and she'd take it home and she'd paint it and then she'd bring it back in for me. And it was just like her going out of her way to include me. That was, it was very moving, very touching. And it's little things like that that I still remember now as an adult. So yeah, that education thing, it sort of struck a nerve. I was like, yeah. And it's a really key point in people's lives, especially for me. Before my adoption, I hadn't gone to nursery. I wasn't in a primary school. So, but it was also a place where I met some of the people who would become my best friends and like my peers and people who would check me when I needed it and people who would help me feel included. And I think that's what it is. It's about finding your tribe. And I found that especially with people, especially going to this PAC-UK adoption group, which I was talking to my social worker one day and I said to her how I didn't physically really like know that, oh, this person's adopted or that person's adopted. So I felt a little bit alone. And she says, oh, well, I know this lady who's a very close friend of mine and I'll put you in touch with her. Put me in touch with the group that I'm now part of. And I think if we could get more groups like that for young people, it definitely saved my life. And I think it'll just do even more good for other young people and even older people. I think it shouldn't have an age limit on it. But that's my 2 cents.
I think your 2 cents are worth $1, JP. Thank you. And meeting other adopted people is just a really powerful thing, I think, and I think that's helped us all, hasn't it? Just some final reflections. If we've got another couple of minutes before I need to present the birth parent one, just on where birth family fits into all this for you. I know that you've all had sort of reunions of one sort or another. Just quick reflections on that, please.
I had a really positive reunion. I don't think my birth mother ever felt like my mother again, and she wasn't the fantasy figure I'd imagined her to be. So it was a bit of a shock when I did meet her because she didn't look like a fairy lady. But you know, we did develop a positive relationship, and she kind of felt like, I don't know, an auntie or something like that. And it was very positive until her death. And meeting my birth family changed everything. yeah, it's 15 years ago now since I met my birth family, and I have great relationships with brothers and sisters. We don't feel quite like brothers and sisters, maybe like cousins, but it's amazing, because if I hadn't done that, I'd be alone in the world right now.
Emma, JP, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I met my birth family when I was 17. And like Julie said, my birth mum didn't feel like my mum, because to me, my adopted mum is my mum. And that was something she really struggled with. She would say, "Why do you say I'm your birth mum?" And I was like, "Well, because you are my birth mum. I've got a mum." But it was a positive experience for me. I don't have contact with them anymore, but it was nice to get to know why I looked like I did. I had, you know, I was like this auntie, I was like that auntie. It was just nice to see why I was like I was and who I looked like. And I guess there was kind of a bit of a bond there as well, actually.
JP, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I know, going back to my birth family, it wasn't planned. My sister contacted me one day on Facebook, and I basically ran away because things were horrible at home and went to go live with her. And but I don't regret it, no. I think it's something inherent inside you. You want to know where you came from.
I think that's probably a good point for us to finish. I have to get on with the birth parent one, but thank you so much, Emma, Jilly, JP. That's amazing to hear from you. And we so wanted to add some faces to this, because it really is about people rather than stats, but put lots of people together and you get stats. So that's what we're doing too, and that has some force. Now I'm going to move on to the birth parent consultation with you, and I'm just going to try and get that up on my screen. Hold on, there we go. Okay. Oh. Okay, great stuff. Can everybody see that now?
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. Okay, as I say, this one's a little bit shorter, but no less crucial for that. So similar, we kept this one open a bit longer. We had fewer respondents, but you know, we were not unhappy with 151 birth parents responding. And as I say, these are birth parents who had children adopted since 1990. There is, you know, a need to look at that earlier generation, undoubtedly so. But here we were looking at the generation which had had contact and a more modern, for want of a better word, sort of adoption going on. Respondents from all over the UK. They were overwhelmingly female, so these are mostly birth mothers. Now, interestingly, or shockingly actually, 43% describe themselves as having a disability currently. Very high numbers. 84%, we said, you know, they could comment on that disability if they wanted to. 84% who chose to comment on their disabilities described these as mental health conditions, sometimes accompanied by learning disabilities or physical illness. So we know, those of us who've worked with this, with birth parents, that these things are going on, but it's really interesting to see that. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So we started off by talking about what happened before the adoption. We said to birth parents what factors were involved in the reasons for their adoption. They could choose more than one option. No big surprises here. 57% of respondents cited domestic violence as a factor in their children's removal. 50% way out ahead of the other two, mental health problems, often the two going together. Down there on 20%, alcoholism or substance abuse, lack of money, previous care experience, and learning disability. But so those two are the biggies really here: mental health problems and domestic violence and abuse. We asked people what to rate and comment on the support given to you and your family at that time. And we have there, going from good at the bottom, 15% satisfactory, 70% said poor. To comment on the support, they said, help me with what they thought I was lacking in, actually getting restraining orders to protect me and my girls rather than take my girls and leave me with no help. Mental health support, access to parenting courses, better communication. So Recommendations, as one parent wrote, increase understanding of domestic abuse and circumstances, and if this is the reason for adoption, to get help and support to escape this so you can keep your child. Increase recurrent proceedings projects for birth parents. They're great, but they're regionally patchy and insufficiently resourced. And increase support to disabled parents to continue their role in the child's life. Court proceedings, we said, was the court process accessible to you? Could you sufficiently take part? So given what we know about the difficulties that many birth parents face and what they've just told us about mental health and disability, we've got a situation where that's sort of got some improvement going on. In the light blue on the left, we've got the yeses. They did feel court was accessible. So it's bobbing up and down, 25, 79, 51, 76%. We asked if they had any support during court proceedings other than a solicitor, and 81% said no. So no advocacy, no family, no nothing to help them through a process that they found quite confounding. 42 respondents commented on this. They said not feeling heard or being able to participate due to lack of support, their disabilities, lack of familiarity with the court process and ability to comprehend the paperwork. Some didn't find it accessible because they simply weren't asked to take part. Some thought more support and advocacy in court could have helped. I was able to speak very little under an uncomfortable amount of pressure whilst dealing with the potential of having your children taken away. It would have helped to have an advocate and be listened to. I just felt like I was left in the background and I didn't matter. It was online, and with my disabilities, I struggled to take it all in compared to if it was in person, presumably during the pandemic. So review the court processes with representatives from these groups. And I know a bit of that has gone on because we've taken part in it, but clearly needs to be more minimum standard of giving information to birth parents about legal advice, yes, but also local and national support groups who might be able to help at this point. So after the adoption, was the information given to you by the social worker and agency about your child's adoption good, satisfactory or poor? And I'm afraid the poors are not really getting any less over time. I was not prepared for how post-adoption works. One minute I could take pictures of my son and tell him I love him. The next I wasn't allowed to do any of that. No one explained how it would work beforehand in the slightest. And even now I can't get that information years later. They told me my children was getting adopted and gave me a leaflet to read. Someone to help explain to me other than just give me paperwork. So there is a gap here, I think. I know that those in agencies will say, yes, of course, they were given that information, which will have been sent by post or they'll try to deliver. But there is a gap here between that and what birth parents are experiencing and understanding about the situation. And here we get on to some of the basics, really, of I think what we think of as adoption today. And are they really working or not? Did you contribute to your child's life storybook? So we've got the yeses on the left in the light blue. Those figures are growing gradually over time, up to 57% in the 2020s, but 43% are still not. So many said they didn't know, they hadn't been asked, they didn't realize that was something which could happen. Others explained that the breakdown of relationships with social workers had led to this. Of those who did contribute, only 29% were satisfied with their input. There were limitations and barriers of what I could or not include. I didn't understand. So this plays obviously back into what we've just been talking about, identity for adopted people. If that child's life storybook doesn't have input from birth family, then clearly that's not going to be so helpful. And there are all sorts of complex why that can come about. Again, a mainstay of modern adoption. Were you offered independent support after the adoption of your child? So the perception of birth parents here is that that's only grown very gradually over the years. This is statutory provision to 28% in the 2020s. Those who did get independent support, 60% rated it as good. So somehow that's not happening or perceived to be happening. Did you meet your child's adoptive parents? Again, one of the sort of, things we are being aimed for in modern adoption. Those numbers are not progressing in the right direction. Now, the 2020s obviously will have been impacted by the pandemic, but even then we've got the majority of birth parents not meeting the child's at all. When asked for the reasons, most said they were not allowed or it wasn't offered. This was never offered to me. I would have liked to have met them. So lots of recommendations around there. Birth parents are supposed to take an active part in planning and implementation of their child's adoption, and clearly that's not happening. We need to review agency information, review statutory support and how that's being provided. I'm going to leave you to read those recommendations on your own and plug on. So, contact with their adopted child. Did you have any contact, direct or indirect, with your adopted child when they were under 18? Those figures are growing there. Roughly echo what we've got from adopted people. 93% said that direct contact should be standard practice between adopted children, young people and birth family where it's deemed safe. So that's the same question, obviously, that we asked to adopted people. How long did you receive letters for? Well, this is where it gets a bit more sticky. And as with adopted people, what we're finding is that that didn't last very long. It tended to peak at 1 or 2 years, 3 to 5 years. And then as we move over towards the left here, we're finding that fewer and fewer people are getting it over 10 years. Only 18% said that their letters were always on time. Others said that they were sometimes or always late. And 12% of the total respondents, that's the 151, received letterbox letters for more than 6 years. So that's a pretty low figure, really. Agency must keep the arrangements for contact under review, review the sending. We haven't included this in this presentation, but there's stuff in the report about photographs and how difficult birth parents find that. And that's almost become a sort of blanket thing of no photographs. Again, invest in digital solutions, letter swap, and pilots are taking place of that, which is great. Reunions over 18. Given the time range of this survey, high numbers of birth parents had had contact with their adopted children over 18, with roughly equal numbers of parents and children being the initiators. So 62% of those whose children were over 18 had had contact with them as an adult. Now remember, these people had adopted since 1990, so these are quite contemporary people, and many of them will still be under 18, so weren't included in this. But 62% had contact with their birth family, with their children as an adult. 48% had been contacted by the adopted adult, so it's obviously going both ways, and 43% had used an intermediary agency. Affordable intermediary services, obviously, and information and support for adopted people, adopters and birth parents around the transition to adulthood of the adopted child and the options available. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing. We're just about bang on time, hurrah. And I'm going to bring in our 3 birth parents. So we've got Christy, Angela and Jill. Could we, sorry, Christy, Angela and Andy. Sorry, almost repurposed you there. Okay, so guys, who would like to start us off? Christy, would you like to just tell us about what chimed with you in that birth parent consult?
Yeah, so the numbers on the mental health stand out like more than any of the others, don't they? There seems to be a perception when it comes to mental health with a birth parent. People seem to think that you've got this mental health from the situation that you're in when you're losing your children, when it's not. It's comfort. It can come as far back as your childhood, and it's brought into adulthood. Now, I'm 18 years into having my children removed, and it wasn't until I got into my 30s that I actually took an understanding of where my mental health problems came from. And it was from my childhood, but there was anybody there to pick up on that or help me with that. Nobody mentioned that when we were going through courts and things. And then once your children are removed, man was domestic violence, then traumas stay with you forever, and they come up in life in so many ways. So for example, being in society, explaining about your children, going to a workplace, and then it may be that you've been in this workplace for 10, 20 years and you have a mental breakdown. This mental breakdown will come out from anywhere. So you go to work and you try and explain this, and you explain that you can't work because you just cannot. You're thinking about your children and a reunion maybe, which it was in my case. And in my case, it was used against me. There was nothing they could do for me. They didn't understand me. There was no acknowledgement of adoption. And I lost my career. I lost my career through that. And I think that so many birth parents will relate to that as well. I've gone to a GP, and I remember early days, I've lost my children, I need help. And he laughed at me. He said that I wasn't depressed. Tribunals, work tribunals, I'm not depressed. I'm able to work. And yes, I probably was able to work now and then, but there was times where the trauma hits you. You don't know when this trauma is going to come out. And I don't think there's enough talk about it. There's not enough out there. We've also got in the report, it refers to National Minimum Standards Regulation 14 of the 2005 Act. Well, mine was 2006, and let me tell you now, there was no support. You could search high and low and you would not find any support. And if anybody knows what support there was back then, put it in the comments, because I'd like to know what they were. Yeah.
Thanks, Christy. That's great and powerful. Angela, would you like to share your thoughts on what resonated for you?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to Christy from the mental health angle, but she's touched on that. So I think for me, it was picking up on the domestic abuse, because domestic abuse was the reason given for removing my children, along with mental health. And unlike in the general population, we talk about domestic abuse, we tell abuse victims, this is not your fault, you're not responsible, you deserve to be helped. Whereas unfortunately within child protection, it seems to work the other way around. And I was held responsible for the perpetrator's actions. I was expected to protect my children when I couldn't. Nobody could. I wasn't able to do that without support. And instead of that support being provided, it was just used as a reason to remove my children. And despite the fact that I'd actually managed to leave that relationship, it was then said, well, actually, you can't prove you're not going to get into an abusive relationship in the future, which is insane, because none of us can. If perpetrators walked around with a warning, we'd all be able to escape from them. So I think it's about treating people in child protection the way we treat people in the rest of society. Being a parent doesn't make you immune to mental health problems or domestic abuse, and the system seems to act as if it does. And I think it's been almost 20 years since I said goodbye to my children, and yet everything I've read in this report mirrors exactly what was going on then. And I find that incredibly frustrating and incredibly sad that actually we haven't changed our practice over that length of time, and that we're not actually treating people any differently. And kind of hoping that in the next 20 years we're not in the same place, and that actually people start to listen and start to see us as victims of abuse, as mental health patients, and not as a risk, which I think is just how we're labelled and how we're seen.
Thank you, Angela. Well said. Andy, should we come to you? What would you like to say about the report?
More to do with the contact, letterbox and stuff like that. Basically, my daughter was adopted in 2012. I've had a letterbox for the past 11 years, twice a year, basically. Like, it's been on time all the time up until very recently. It's been a little bit late, but it doesn't bother me so much because I do know that it's going to come. But to other parents, it's quite heartbreaking for them, knowing that a letter isn't arriving, or it can be quite late, or can even set the mental health off. But me personally, I had contact with my kids up until the adoption went through. Now, I wasn't a risk then, So why would it be that I have to stop contact altogether and still be able to, like, see him once a week, once a month? There's no issue there, but that was stopped and it went to letterbox. But at the time, I had 2 children, like as well, who are like a couple of years younger, who are growing up and they're wanting to know more about their older sister, should I say. But I can't give them anything more than what my letterbox is giving me. And to me, there's nothing there. That I don't get a lot out of that to tell them. And this is where the issues are. It seems quite bland and it comes across as that there's no bond between adoptive parents and birth parents. So really there should be more to support us as birth parents to get more out of the adoptive parents, to at least get a bit more of it, your child's life, really.
Well said, Andy. I just wanted to raise a final point with all of you, actually, was that because I hope it's all right to say that all of you I know have gone on to parent children, you know, after adoption has happened. And
can I just point out, I was actually a father to my son while the adoption was going through, of 6 months old.
Yeah.
But my daughter was still adopted. I don't get that.
Just talk to me a little bit about, just briefly about change, how people change, and also, as you raised, Andy, the impact on your other children of not knowing their siblings, if you like, and not really having contact with them. Anyone want to say anything about that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. I was very fortunate in the beginning. I managed to secure a letterbox. It was brilliant. It was properly supported. I had a named advisor that I could speak to at any point about anything. And her goal was reunification. Simple as that. She could see no reason why myself and particularly my eldest son could not be reunified. We had a very close relationship and bond. Sadly, when she retired, that was the end of that. Letterbox broke down, everything went wrong. Nobody would answer my letters, nobody would answer my phone calls, and I inevitably lost my children for a second time. The local authority had all of the information on me. I was fortunate to be able to work with a family rights group, to be able to have a voice, to really start to try and speak out for other birth parents. And I still didn't hear from my children. And when in 2020, I was contacted out of the blue by my previous local authority to say my eldest son would like to contact me. Now, obviously, I was over the moon. I was delighted. We exchanged a couple of emails and then we FaceTimed. And I was absolutely devastated to find out that he'd been attempting to contact me since he turned 18, but that the local authority had said I was a risk. Now, by this point, I was remarried. I had a daughter with no local authority involvement. I worked in some very senior parts of family justice, but somebody had looked at a file written nearly 20 years ago and had made a judgment call about me and my son without having met either of us. And he sadly has only just this past weekend married his fiance, and I was unable to attend the wedding because my youngest son isn't ready, and I respect that completely. But I can't help but think, what if when my son wanted to contact me all those years ago, when his little sister was desperate to meet him, what if we'd been supported to actually reconnect then? Could I have been part of that? Could I have been a part of his life for longer than I have been? And could he have had his sister in his life for longer? So I think it's not just about making sure that we have this contact, it's about reviewing it. It's about making sure that we accept and understand that everybody is capable of change and that everybody's needs change, and what's right for a 5-year-old isn't right for a 15-year-old, and really starting to tailor this rather than it being a one size fits all, which usually means one size fits no one.
Thank you, Angela. That's great. We're going to have to wind up that fantastic little discussion there. I wish we could go on for a long time, but thanks so much, Andy, Christy and Angela, for that. That's great. we're going to finish in a couple of minutes. I hope that's been really rewarding for you. I mean, this has just been a taster of these consults. I really encourage you. We'll send them out and get them on the website, spread them far and wide to give it a good read, use it as reference. And if you want us or to come and speak about those reports, then just get in touch, and I'm sure we can deliver something for you. And few thank yous, really. Thank you to Sarah and her team for commissioning this, to Kath at Creative Switch, who did the design, which saved me from PowerPoint hell just a few days ago, and has designed these reports, which are really readable and designed beautifully and look like something you can really get your head round. And my colleagues at PAC-UK, particularly to Leon, who's put on the tech side of all this today, and Emma, who's been monitoring the chat. Thanks so much. And mostly to all the people who responded to our survey, and also to the birth parents and adopted people who've appeared with us today. So thanks very much. I hope you have a happy lunchtime in the sun, because it's shining where I am. I hope it is where you are. Okay, bye-bye.